Hello everyone and welcome back to City Skylines, to the Altengrad city. Yes, we are back in Altengrad and we will continue building the city some more. But let's first do a quick recap of the city's current state. The core of the city is done, at least the old town is completely done, which is right in the center with the castle hill. There are two train stations, although one of them still needs some work. There are a couple of interesting buildings in the city. The most recent addition was the parliament with some ministries or other government buildings. There are theaters, lots of churches, and so on. We also built the remnants of the old city walls and barracks, 3 custom bridges over the rivers, and a train viaduct. One of the unfinished projects is also the cargo harbor, which we will see a bit more today. It is clear that the city is far from complete, but on the other hand, it's definitely not small anymore. So where to go from here? I need to make some plans for that. I don't want to just make some mindless expansion, because it's not really going to be all that interesting, even though it's going to be needed in some places. So I'm not going to fully escape that, but I want to have some plan where exactly is the city going to end. The first place that is prepared to be an edge of the city is close to the cargo harbor, about here. I prepared some tracks right here when we built the harbor, some sort of medium-sized train yard, but it also already has a passenger station building. There are a couple of tracks, tram tracks, leading from the city into this area as well. So the plan today is to build a town, a small town right on the edges of Altengrad, and this is going to mark the edge of an area that I would like to build the city on. So if we take the distance from here, roughly to the castle hill in the middle, it means that in the opposite direction, the city needs to grow something like this, maybe. Over the river, something like this, and obviously where the parliament building is, there will have to be some sort of high-density blocks and probably the same distance from the castle hill as the previous directions. Very rough plan, of course, something that I will have to work on, a lot in the future, but hopefully we will get there eventually. At this time period, the town that we are going to build today is not part of Altengrad officially, just yet. It has its own mayor and everything, but it's obviously already closely tied to Altengrad itself, as most people living here go to the city every day to work, to school, to shop. So the city is part of the Altengrad's urban area. That is also the reason why they decided to extend the tram network into this place. This concept of smaller towns around the main city is something that I will continue doing because it's very common, and many city parts in today's big cities were small towns or villages 100 years ago. It's also a simple way of building an actual end of the built area, in the game at least. So let's talk about the town itself and how it's going to look. As you can see, I started with some town square. It's a good place to start with some sort of a town, just start with the town square. I placed a town hall, and I also started with some high-density buildings, but not all that tall, because this town is supposed to be rather small, so I don't really want to overdo it with the high-density structures. But around the town square, it kind of felt fitting. As you could have seen, I kind of struggled picking the right buildings that I can place here, because like I said, I don't really want to do like super high density buildings in there, but I want to have them, fitting for that small town feel. So nothing all that super high density, even though they are technically high density buildings. But this is actually going to be an interesting problem that I'm going to talk a bit more about later. Now, this connection right underneath the tracks, that's actually a very important connection. It's a key connection in this place because it's going to allow access to the cargo harbor and the industrial zone in general on the other side of the tracks from the town square. And it's going to be an access, basically, for people living in this small town and working in the industrial zones or the cargo harbor. Obviously, as we progress further in time, the cargo harbor and the industrial zone, the adjacent industrial zones, are going to get larger, and maybe even some residential areas are going to follow. But right now, I'm imagining that, yeah, sure, a lot of people living in this small town are working in some of these, close industrial zones. But maybe some of them, majority of them maybe, are also working somewhere in the city. So that's why I built the tram tracks already to this place. I didn't say it, but you could have probably seen that one side of the square is a tram road. So there's obviously going to be a stop, some sort of a main tram stop for the town. I'm continuing with doing some roads, some infrastructure, and this is actually a very important road because that's going to be the connection to the edge of the map. So there's going to be a lot of traffic going through this town, and I would imagine that historically this town was maybe some sort of an intersection between various roads that entered Altengrad, and that's probably where this town actually started, on the town square. But at this point in time, they kind of reworked or refurbished this historical road, let's say, for the trams. And the bulk of the traffic, cargo traffic as well, into the industrial zone, I would imagine, is just going to be slightly diverted into that parallel street that's going to go closer to the tracks, kind of. It's definitely something new that might have been constructed very recently, but I think I'm actually going to talk a bit more about that as well. Anyway, you could have seen me in some of those previous shots that I basically just put a lot of buildings to like a very plain road. Now, what was that? What was the reason behind that? Now, that was some sort of a palette, like a drawing palette, a color palette of all buildings that I can use in this town. Now, this is the major difference between building Altengrad, and why I was not exactly all that sure if I want to continue with it, and building Aurelia. Because in Aurelia, I can build pretty much everything I want, because it's a futuristic city. I can do whatever kind of design I want. But obviously in Altengrad, I kind of need to make sure that I'm following some styles, especially the historical styles, of course. I need to make sure that the buildings are justified in this time period. And I also need to pay attention to the density of the building, if it's not too big, too large, if it looks all right, if it just fits the overall theme of the city, right? And it's kind of difficult to judge that from from just a little thumbnails. Some buildings have them, not exactly all that clear how the building looks like. So I basically created like a palette of buildings, and I put it just outside of the places that I'm building right here. I think you're gonna see that, maybe you already saw that in the time lapse, how I'm just copy pasting some buildings from that palette into these places that I'm building. I think I might do it right now, right here, when I'm choosing some of the very low density buildings to build here. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I went into this palette. As you can see, there are various buildings in this palette, and they are mostly vanilla buildings, surprisingly. These buildings are from the European Suburbia pack, because these buildings are definitely something that I would see in like 1920s, 1930s Europe. And that probably leads me to a very important change, but it's not really all that important as you might imagine. You can already see down in the interface, whatever, that the name of the city changed from Altengrad 1920s into Altengrad 1930s. So yes, we finally did the switch to 1930s, and it's not really all that relevant at this point, because honestly, I only did this switch. I think I talked about this a long time before, when I just ranted about not being able to build a lot of structures because I felt like they are not exactly justified in 1920s, but they would be fine in 1930s. And that kind of was very important with these low density structures, because the buildings from the European suburbia are hard to justify in 1920s. But I'm 100% sure that some of these buildings that I saw there were built in the Czech Republic, for example, in the 1930s as part of some like high-end residential, low-density residential areas or something like that. And even the vehicles that we have in the game right now are more fitting to the 30s than 20s. So I did the switch, okay? I did the switch. There are probably going to be some 1930s changes in the main city. I do have some very nice big office buildings that I would like to just place instead of some, really old buildings in some of these blocks. So I'm definitely going to not forget that when we finally get to it. But right now, the switch to 1930s, like I said, basically just allows me to do more variety with these low density structures. So Not really a super important switch into the 1930s. The city is not really going to see like severe changes between the 20s and 30s. So it's just something that allows me to have more variety, like I said probably a million times before already. So I probably should have started the series even in 1930s. Like I said, the vehicles are more fitting to that time period. Everything in the Steam workshop just fits to the 30s more than the 20s. All right. So don't really look too much into it. It's just a change to have more possibilities in the city. There are obviously going to be much more severe changes between the 30s and 40s because of the war, obviously. But right now, this is really not important. Okay, so we just did the switch, but it's not a big deal. Anyway, let's continue with building some of these blocks. So I should probably mention already that this place is not going to be finished today, okay? That's kind of clear. This project is rather big, and you can probably see that with the end cinematics that I actually built quite a huge area for this project, and it's definitely not going to be finished. All these blocks of low-density buildings are not going to be done. We're going to keep that for the next part. I should probably comment this, because that was kind of important. When I started building Altengrad right from the start, I did, well, not really extensive research, but I did some research in regards to how exactly roads look like in this time period, because I honestly didn't know. There obviously weren't highways, right? There were no highway networks in European cities. Maybe American cities already had highway networks. I don't know. I mean, sure, there were some highway networks in the 30s already before the war, but they were not everywhere, and they definitely were not in the state as we see it today. So how exactly roads look like in this time period between towns, between cities? Are they some sort of like dirt roads or asphalt roads already? I didn't know. I did some research about that, and I even found some historical photographs, and it was actually not uncommon to have asphalt roads at this time period, although they were kind of rare. But I'm not sure how they're called. Cobblestone roads maybe were kind of common. It was not really the usual cobblestone that you see in the historical parts of old towns, for example, but they were some sort of stone roads. Gravel roads were also super common in this time period, especially between smaller cities. But between the smaller, like super small villages, you usually had some sort of dirt roads. But how is this going to translate into city skylines? Because you obviously need to have some way of building that. Now, I downloaded a pack of UK roads. Now, it's a pack of roads that are basically nothing like the vanilla roads. They are very unique, very distinct. I suppose they are very common in the UK, but for this time period, they are also very fitting. You could have seen me experiment with a couple of them right at the edge there. That's basically the place where I built the tram loop. I didn't comment the tram loop as well, but it's just a tram loop. I'm probably going to comment more about it in the next episodes because it's kind of not finished right now, but that's not important. We need to talk about the roads. So I finally decided to do those kinds of roads that you could have seen me place there. It's basically just a asphalt texture, which in Altengrad is replaced by a very dark looking cobblestone, I guess. So that's kind of fitting for this rural intercity road at this time period. But I basically have nothing better, okay? I would need to put some sort of a mud road in there instead, and I think that would be worse. So this is actually pretty much perfect for this time period and for some sort of a road like that one. The only disadvantage is that these UK roads have like a very sharp edges of the grass texture. They do have the theme grass around the asphalt portion, but then they kind of cut the grass texture and you have the ruined texture instead. So that's why I experimented a bit more with the theme mixer and I decided to go for a different ruined texture. But in the end, I decided to switch it back to the original one. And there is that weird edge on the roads. I'm not sure, it's probably not going to be really visible in the cinematics. Maybe it will be. Maybe you will notice that. Maybe you won't. It's kind of a detail, tiny detail, but I really wanted to go back to the original textures that I chose for Altengrad because it's just looking the best, right? So that's going to be a thing that I'll probably need to solve in the future if I want to really have those rural intercity roads look convincing. But this is fine. This is not bad either. Anyway, that's enough for the roads, I guess. While I was explaining that, you could have seen me detail that tiny industrial zone, tiny industrial area that was enclosed with that network fence. I did some procedural objects for the gates, for the main entrance gate, and some of those gates for the tracks even. As you can see, I'm using procedural objects quite a lot with even some buildings to manipulate some buildings. This passenger train station building is also a procedural object. I don't exactly remember what was the original reason for converting it into PO, but I guess there was some reason. The building is very dark, but unfortunately that's as bright as you can make it. Unfortunately, the building is very, very dark, and you can't really make it any brighter, but it's all right. It's definitely the best looking rural railroad building that I have right now. So I kind of like it. I really like how it looks like, even with the darkness that it has. Anyway, I started just some detailing around some of these places around the train yard. The train yard definitely is not finished. It needs some more switches between the tracks. It definitely needs to have some parked, cars, rail cars and locomotives maybe. But I just started detailing some of these small, very, very small industrial places around the train yard. So for example, this really small industrial area with just a couple of tracks, maybe some coal storage areas, not necessarily, coal for just the trains, but also for, homes. Obviously, people used coal to heat up their homes in this time period, and coal was obviously transported on railroads these days. So the main distribution centers for coals would definitely be around these train yards or train stations, right? That's definitely some element that is going to go away as we progress further in time. So these are kind of the last detailing things that I'm doing in this little town. As you can see, these buildings do look rather modern, and like I mentioned before, these kinds of structures were definitely not common in the 1920s. Maybe you could have seen them in 1920 somewhere, but I just feel that these buildings are just right for the pre-war, like right before the war period, right? 1930s. So I'm really satisfied with especially this block because it has these buildings. It kind of looks like these buildings are very similar, even though there are tiny differences. They are not completely the same models. Well, I think these three at the tip are, but these two other ones are not. So this was actually very, very common in the 1930s, at least where I live, right? Now, the last thing that I did there was just put some fences. I didn't really want to overdo it too much with the fences because I want to keep an eye on the limits for props, because this is definitely not the last little village that we are going to do outside of Altengrad. So if I did them like super detailed, we would really struggle with having the limits for props. So I just did a couple of fences, especially around the roads, the streets, and between the individual houses I didn't really bother too much. And the backyards I mostly filled with just trees because it's the most important detailing piece in these projects, and maybe put some benches in there and stuff like that. With some of the more low-end areas, let's call them, I did place some like garbage on the surfaces, like some wood and just some, I don't know, trash piles or stuff like that. Even with the industrial zones, I kind of tried to make them look a bit scruffy or something like that. So it's just not going to be all trees, right, in the backyards, and detailing is just not going to be all that green. But I don't really want to say that I'm trying to do quantity over quality in here, but to be fair, this place or these towns around Altengrad are going to be quite large. So, helping myself with this some sort of slightly lazier detailing is something that's just going to be necessary if I'm realistically ever going to finish this entire town, right? So that was pretty much all for the time lapse, and I'm actually going to talk even around the cinematics. So That's the small town. Well, I almost said finished. This project for today is finished, but the small town is not finished. As you can obviously see, there are some empty blocks that I already prepared with the roads, and especially around the tram loop, there's nothing there yet. I would like to continue next episode doing actually on both sides of the train yard. I would definitely want to expand close towards the harbor, maybe add some more industrial zones, and definitely some more tracks connected to the train yard, of course, because all the industrial buildings, or at least larger industrial areas, will have their own tracks connected to the main network so that the cargo can just be transported into various parts of the city and obviously exported outside the city as well. So that's the plan. But I would also like to expand the residential areas, especially around those tram tracks that we built. So maybe some slightly more modern houses. I was even thinking of some apartment buildings, like a very recently built residential project, because extending these tram tracks into this town would there would be some kind of a motivation, like a bigger motivation to do that, right? And some sort of a bigger residential area might serve as a very good motivation for that. So maybe we are going to explore that possibility next time. There definitely were some bigger residential projects before the war. I mean, we already have one in the city in form of those 1920s apartments, which are actually, it's kind of a coincidence that they are also built around a new tram loop. I think that was actually just a couple of episodes back, on the other side of the river. That place on the other side of the river where we did that tram loop, that's probably actually an edge of the city already. I know it's kind of close to the center already, but I think that maybe I'm just going to add like a couple of very low density houses after that place and we're going to be done. But the place of the city that will have to be expanded quite a lot is probably the Parliament building. That's where I will have to put a lot of some high density buildings to kind of, justify having the Parliament building there. It would be kind of weird if I built a Parliament building and it would just be like farm fields right next block, right? That's just not going to look very good. But I'm kind of, going on various tangents in here. So anyway, let's wrap up this episode. Let's wrap up this project for today. As you can see, we did quite a large chunk of the map, which is nice. I think I'm also going to work on doing some of the terraforming around this place. So maybe even some farms and just do some trees and just finish the map. Because right now the map has some trees and farm fields, let's say, and I'm just cutting them away with Move It, so it's just looking strange, right? So maybe I know that this is already the edge of the city, so I'm going to already do some final detailing to the rest of the map, at least in this direction away from the city, okay? Anyway, that's it for today. I'm not sure what's going to be the next episode, if it's going to be Altengrad, Aurelia, or something. Probably Aurelia, because I already had it prepared. And it's going to take me a while before I'm going to do something significant in Altengrad, okay? So next episode in Altengrad is kind of clear what we need to do. So that's probably all I need to say. I hope you liked today's episode of Altengrad, guys. If you did, then you can always put a thumbs up underneath the video. You can share the video if you want. And if you are new here, you can definitely subscribe to the channel. And I will see you next time. All right, guys? So take care, be safe, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.